Hey guys, so I wanted to use my client Alex's deadlift as a way to showcase a few cues that maybe you could use to help with your deadlift. So a few weeks ago, Alex was having trouble with weights that normally would be totally achievable for him. And we can see here he's having trouble off the floor. He's getting stuck at lockout. Even at these reps at 495, things are looking a little sloppy, a little messier than they normally would. Now, the reason that these lifts were feeling harder than they should have was because Alex wasn't getting into the best technique for him in his starting position of the sumo deadlift. We can see here in this freeze frame, look at Alex's pelvic and back position, okay? He's going to what we call posterior pelvic tilt, wherein the pelvis is sort of tucking underneath your torso, and there's a lot of flexion in his spine, okay? You can have a little bit of flexion in the spine of the deadlift, it's not a problem, but if it starts to impede your lockout, then it's obviously something that needs to be fixed. The reason that posterior pelvic tilt often interferes with lockout in the deadlift is just because when your pelvis tucks posteriorly, that causes the glute and hamstring to shorten prematurely, meaning you can't really use them at lockout the way that you would be able to otherwise if you had a neutral lumbar spine in the deadlift. So you're going to see here in some of these reps, until we switch gears momentarily, you're going to see that Alex is, again, having a lot of that curvature in the spine and really having some issues at lockout. Now, the cues that I gave him to fix this issue were to, one, start with the bar a little bit further away from his shins by about half an inch. Number two, during the slack portion of his slack and wedge, I asked him to really think about almost cueing a tiny bit of extension in the lumbar spine. Number three, we also focused a bit on shoulder protraction, actively pushing the shoulders forward and down to make the arms a little bit longer. And then finally, for our fourth cue, I asked him to really focus on driving the knees out and away from each other in the bottom position of the deadlift as he wedges his hips forward into the start position. This picture shows Alex's technique prior to these cueing changes, and in a second you're going to see a picture of his starting position after those cueing changes, with his hips much closer to the bar and his torso much more upright with a more neutral spine all the way through. A little bit of flexion in the upper back, but that's totally fine. That won't interfere with lockout whatsoever. The main thing is that we avoided that posterior pelvic tilt that was happening prior to these technique changes, which allowed Alex to get a much stronger lockout and actually come back the following week and dominate the weights that he had programmed the prior week that gave him a bit of trouble. So watch out for this in your deadlift, and if you have any technique questions, feel free to ask them below or shoot me a DM.